Well, good evening, everyone. Well, here we are, a new history of the human race question and answers. We've got like 5 million questions people have sent in. I estimate that if Dr. Jeanson spends 1 minute on each question, we could have them all answered by next year. But actually, it's been really good to see the tremendous response to all of this. And before we get underway here, we've got a lot of questions that are already sent in. We've already got live questions. They've been putting them up on YouTube. And of course, now there's Facebook and answers.tv as well. Dr. Jeanson, would you like to make any comments to start with? Would you like to just give a couple of introductory comments, and then we'll get underway answering as many questions as we can?
Yes, I've been very pleased with how many questions we've received. We probably will not be able to get through all of them tonight, and this is, if you don't get your question answered directly, it's not because we were trying to ignore it. We had to filter through and hit the top ones. We may, at some point, have a part two, depending on the response we get this evening. Tonight, we're going to cover a number of things based on what I've already seen in the written questions. Some things to clarify that were obviously not clear because multiple people asked the same question from previous episodes. We're eventually going to also cover the practical question. What can you do to find out your family history based on the Y chromosome, your ethnicity, who your ancestors were, what are the next steps in this? You want to support this? I've had people say, can I submit my own DNA for your project? We'll get to all of those by the end of tonight. So this will be a really exciting time that'll be all over the map based on what we've seen already. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Okay, well, Dr. Jeanson, I've got 3 questions that were sent in. We'll use those first, and I'll put up the first one here. So we'll go to those first, and then we can get on with looking at some of the live ones as well. So, and we'll probably alternate between the ones that were sent in and the live. So first one, are modern Jews all of Turkish descent?
And this is a good question. I've seen from a couple of folks, including Jews, who had some comments, and some were not too pleased with what I said in episode 18, and I realized I wasn't very clear on the point I was trying to make. I emphasized a point that the mainstream scientific community did, and I didn't get to everything else they said. So let me back up to episode 18, where I was arguing that one of the dominant lineages in modern Jewish people, particularly Ashkenazi Jewish people, there was this paper in 2009 that came out claiming they could find one that seemed to fit all the proper parameters for being a Jewish lineage. Episode 18, we walk through some of the problems. The lineage specifically, and this is a direct screenshot from the paper. You may not be able to zoom in and see here. I'm going to try to highlight here. There's a whole bunch of different lineages being shown. There's D, E, C, G, H, I, J, L. There's many of the major groups in this tree that we've seen, and they have arranged by columns here the frequency of these various lineages in various Jewish groups. So this first column, which is headed by the letter C for the Kohanim, those who claim descent from the Jewish priesthood. This I column is just Israelites in general, who don't necessarily claim descent from the priesthood. And here's the percentage overall. The point I was emphasizing in that episode was dealing with one particular lineage, this J. You may not be able to see here because the screen is so small, but it's this J-P58. It's a sub-branch of the J lineage. I went on to conclude that J is probably an echo of the Turkish conquest of the Middle East, going in and then being pushed out by the Mongols and coming back in again. The reason I spent a lot of time there was because this was the main lineage that the paper highlighted as being potentially Jewish. What I didn't emphasize as clearly was, and you can see it in this chart, there's all sorts of other lineages present in this tree to which Jewish people belong. We didn't talk about it because what got the most press was this J lineage. They were trying to say this must be Jewish, and I was saying, no, I think even though this is one of the more prominent lineages in the Ashkenazi Jews, this is probably not the original Jewish one. It appears to be Turkish. That does not mean all Jewish people are of Turkish descent, as if somehow the Jewish lineage has disappeared. There are multiple other lineages all throughout this tree. In general, J occupies a significant fraction of this, but there are, if you go to this paper and you look up this particular table, there's members of group E, including this E1B1B that we talked about in episode 19 being perhaps connected to the Arab Muslims, conquest of North Africa. There's a lot of really intriguing connections there. That's worth investigating further as it relates to the Jews. They're members of Group G. We didn't talk about this at all because I haven't quite yet figured out what this Group G represents, but it's something to consider going forward. Again, if you remember from the most recent episodes, we're just beginning now. We've only sampled less than 5,000 men from around the globe. The number of lineages is going to increase with time, and new answers may emerge, especially those that relate to ancient history. So there's members in Group G, there's some in Group H. H relates to India, which we mentioned only briefly in the last episode. There are some in Group I. L we didn't talk about. Q even. There's R1b, R1a. R2 is a mainly Indian lineage we didn't talk about as well. There's Jewish people there. Group T. So there's all sorts of lineages to which Jewish people belong. My main point in episode 18 was the one that got all the press as supposedly being the Jewish one is based on the mainstream timescale. So that in and of itself is reasons for a red flag. And when we went through the specific data, the answer to me that emerges is no, that particular lineage appears to be Turkish in origin. That does not mean all Jewish people are Turkish. There's many other candidates for a potential Jewish lineage. More research will need to be done to figure that out.
Well, you can tell Dr. Jeanson is actually a scientist, a PhD scientist, because he takes millions of years to answer a question. But but Dr. Jeanson, thank you for that. And I put up the second one that we had. We had about 60 different questions that we took from all the questions that were sent in that sort of summarized everything. There was a ton of questions sent in. But anyway, there's number 2. What happened to Japheth's line? Might one of the boys have been a twin?
This is one that came up frequently, this question. Japheth, what happened to the lineage? When I was talking about the family tree and where to put Noah, and again, the question of where exactly Noah is in the tree is one that's being still researched. I've put him right here. He might be slightly up here, slightly down here. I don't have enough data yet to resolve this. And one of the questions that comes up with my favorite position for Noah is there's only 2 branches that come off of him, so where's the third? And I'm putting Shem and Ham as being 2 of the branches and Japheth being the question mark. One of the answers I suggested was it may simply be a question of sampling. Less than 5,000 men in the globe, 4 billion, nearly 4 billion men total. We've got a long way to go before we sample the globe, so his lineage may eventually emerge. He may just be at low frequency today. There's a lot that's happened since the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel. One thing I didn't get to, though, is what if one of these boys, what if 2 of these 3 boys were actually twins, which is something we didn't discuss at all. What if Shem and Japheth were twins? One was the old, one came out first, one came out second, or Japheth and Ham. How would that look in a Y chromosome family tree? It would look like this. You would have 2 branches. If they were identical twins, they would have the same Y chromosome lineage coming off, most likely. And that may be an explanation if Noah is indeed where I think he is. But again, if I had to take a guess as to what I think is most likely at this case, my guess is it's probably a question of sampling at this point. We just haven't gotten enough men in the globe to have found it yet. Again, 5,000 versus nearly 4 billion. That's a huge mathematical difference. And it's something that needs to be investigated further. It may also be Noah isn't where I think he is. He may be one of those other 2 positions. So that's where it's at right now.
Okay, so Dr. Jeanson, by the way, we have people from Australia, people from Canada, people from other parts of the world that are watching that told us where they're from. And I just got a notice from our IT guy that's looking after this for us. And he said, you can announce live streaming next Saturday. In other words, there's so many questions, so much interest in this. How about we do part 2 of question and answers next week on Saturday? Seeing as Sunday over here in America is Father's Day, we'll make it Saturday Eastern Standard Time at 8 p.m. For part 2. So Dr. Jeanson, you up for that next week?
Yep.
Okay, so third question I just put up there, that is this one, and then we'll go to some of the live questions as well. You said the 3 mitochondrial DNA groups represent the 3 wives of Noah's sons. Seems like a 4th group was also present. Who are they? I know outside your office you have a big picture of this, and I even asked you about that. Doesn't that look like a 4th group? So what's your answer to that?
Let's bring up this slide again so we can all be on the same page. This is very similar to the graph I have outside my office, where you can see almost a bullseye type shape. So just to clarify again, so that we're all on the same page, modern people are at the tips of each of these branches. You probably can't see their names here because I've tried to compress several hundred people into one family tree. You've got long branches out this way, shorter ones out here, but there seems to be sort of a bullseye center right around there. And I think that's significant. That's where I think is likely the beginning for the tree. It seems to be the most natural center for it. If you're thinking, again, just of humans, evolutionists change the orientation because they throw in chimpanzee. And if you look at this, there seems to be three major groupings, which seems to fit our lineages going back to the three wives of Noah's sons. This is DNA that's inherited through moms. We talked a lot about this in episode 5 primarily. You might also see, though, that there's a fourth group out here. And this can cause concern. Well, isn't this a contradiction to what you're saying? Are you implying there might be another lineage? Here's the dirty little secret when it comes to these sorts of analyses. Clusters will form like this all the time. And if you look carefully at this tree, you can see there's a cluster right there. And look at my big screen over here. There's a cluster right there. There's a cluster right there. There's clusters that show up all over the place. And that's because clusters simply represent common ancestors. And lots of us, as we've discussed in the first 6 episodes, lots of us will have lots of common ancestors. So you get enough people, you're going to see them come back to a common ancestor. The reason I focus on these 3 and why I think these are good candidates for being the 3 wives of Noah's sons is because they're ancient. They're right near the beginning. So you're going to have clusters that are further out. Those don't seem like good candidates for the wives of Noah's sons because history is past. They're supposed to be at the beginning, the restart of the human race. They're ancient. They happen to be 3 in total, and they're fairly robust. They show up time and time again in analyses after analyses, so much so that even the evolutionists recognize it. So anyone who's concerned, oh, well, is this contradictory data? No, even the evolutionists recognize there's 3 major groups. They happen to be the ancient ones. These still have remained, after years of searching, the best candidates for these being the wives of Noah's sons. Now, something else I want to point out, I don't know how many technical questions we'll get to, but I want to reiterate these 3 major papers that have come out all within about the last half year. The first 2 papers came out in December of 2019. This last one down here in April. These deal with the details of the Y chromosome clock and objections to it, and are the firm defense against evolutionary attacks should you run into this. So we've talked a lot about the implications beyond it, but if you want the hardcore defense of it, that's the place to go looking.
Okay, well, Dr. Jeanson, seeing as there was a person on, there was a few actually, right before we even went live on YouTube in the very first question. So I thought we should give that person opportunity having that answered. I don't know how to pronounce the name and what the name means. Herman, Opepe. Anyway, the question, the very first question there, have you reconsidered what time frame the Wallam Olam is talking about? You have to tell me what the Wallam Olam is, by the way. How populated do you think the Americas were during the famine in Egypt?
Yes, this hits 2 of the past episodes. The Wallam Olam was the Delaware Indian, or the Lenni Lenape people, their written or oral record that came to Western attention in the early 1800s that seems to record, so this is a lot we covered in episode 11, you can see there for the details. It seems to record a crossing of the Bering Strait around a time that's very consistent with what the Y chromosome clock indicates. It looks like there were people here before them. It looks like they arrived in the early AD era. All this together implies that there were other people before today's Native Americans, or to put it in a very politically incorrect way, it looks like today's Native Americans were not the first Native Americans. There are people here before them who apparently were wiped out by them, and the Wallam Olam seems to describe this. With respect to the second question, this is something we hit much more in the last several episodes, 20, 21, 22, 23, based on our ability to convert evolutionary or carbon-14 based dates to young Earth calendar dates. My impression is there was hardly anyone, perhaps no one in the Americas during the famine in Egypt. There may be archaeological evidence for agriculture, but you don't have any state formation. You don't have the Olmecs until after the famine. So I'm leaning towards the idea, based on the data that we have currently, that there was no one here until after Joseph's famine. And I think we may see the echo of that in the Y chromosome, where all these lineages branch out. So now I'll try to keep my answers shorter. since we're
since we're getting so many, and we're going to have part 2 next week, 8 p.m. next week anyway. So because there's so much interest in this. By the way, that has great bearing on, I don't know, people's attitudes in regard to looking in history and realize, you look at this group, but they might have wiped out that group, and they might have wiped out a previous group, and it sort of changes your whole view of things, doesn't it? Well, we had a number of people ask this question, and it is in regard to the work by Bill Cooper and also Bodie Hodge. And so the question there, how does your work fit with Bill Cooper's work? I think he wrote the book After the Flood, and then Bodie wrote the book on the Tower of Babel, and they deal with genealogies. And people have asked how your work meshes with them, seeing as we've sold Bill Cooper's book, and of course we sold Bodie Hodge's book.
These are very important questions. And the larger question is, how do you synthesize multiple fields of science together? The shorter answer is, it's a little early to do so, because we're dealing with the DNA from 5,000 people or less. We're basically dealing with last man standing, last conqueror wins. And we're not dealing with the full spectrum of history yet, because we just don't have enough DNA sequences. So once we get more DNA sequences, then we can begin to look at some of these very specific genealogies that they've been documenting and laying out. But until we get more DNA, it's going to be tough to compare apples to apples, so to speak.
Okay, so and the second question that was waiting for us there was, are some Africans descendants of the ancient Israelites? And that's from Michael.
Good question. So we have mention in Scripture, looking at the end of I think it's 2 Kings. Also, you see in Jeremiah, there were Israelites who went down to Egypt, to Africa. Are there people in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa today, who are descendants of these people? Scripturally, that would suggest yes. Whether or not we can identify this genetically, or whether actually the more relevant question is, are they identifiable in our present databases? They may be there and we haven't recognized them yet. Again, there have been some of these major lineages like group G and group T and group L that we haven't discussed, because I don't know who they are yet. They occur at low frequencies right now. They're in the 1% or less category. And these sorts of lineages, plus the many more that are going to eventually emerge, that's what this data predicts, those might eventually give us the answers. So it's a very intriguing hypothesis to explore further. I just can't say yet with the data that we have whether we have evidence for it in the family tree.
Okay, so one that was sent in to us, I thought this is interesting because you sort of talked about this, but I think it's good to clarify. Could you explain how the presumed timelines, evolutionary versus YEC, young Earth, changes the interpretation of the Y chromosome data?
There's two major points of departure once you try to mesh and reinterpret this through the lens of evolution. One is the tree changes its orientation, begins in Africa, not in the Middle East. And so the first major sets of events are all African because of how they've reoriented the entire structure of the tree. That's one major consequence. The second one is both the relative and the absolute timing of events. So we're seeing things through our lens that match up with known history. These are things they can't even look for because the distribution and the multiplication of J lineages, for example, happens thousands of years ago, not even contemporary with the Ottoman Empire or the movement of the Seljuk Turks or any of these sorts of things. The movement of the Mongols, we talked about this in group R1A, that happens thousands of years ago. So all these events that we've been talking about, they don't even think about looking for these things because they've stretched out the time scale over such a long period of time, it basically all disappears. That's the sad consequence of trying to see all this through the lens of evolution.
Okay, well, Dr. Jeanson, I'll put you on the spot here because you don't know which of these live questions I'm going to choose. And by the way, some people out there, the techie guys might be interested. We're not using Zoom, and to make this more flexible and make it a higher quality, we're actually using StreamYard.com. So and it enables this flexibility here. And I'm in my office, and you're in your office, and our IT person's in their office, and they're controlling this, and we're having fun here. So Stan Graham asked a question. Dr. Jeanson, why do you refer to Papua New Guinea political term instead of New Guinea geographical term?
for ease of communication, and because I probably don't know the political history well enough to say otherwise. So there's my confession.
Oh, well, that makes it easy, doesn't it? Okay, well, let's go to one of the written in questions now. I thought this was an interesting one, actually. And it's to do with Neanderthal. And the question is there no part, if I can get this to work here, there we go. Is there no part of the Neanderthal's DNA that is reliable enough to estimate for them a rough position in the genetic tree relative to the established haplogroups?
The shorter answer is I wish. They're these ancient peoples, so mysterious, and we want to know the answer. Who are they? But because we don't have a good check on what they're doing, well, I should say, we have an independent check of whether or not their DNA mutates a lot or whether it's unreliable. And I've already published data saying I think it's unreliable or maybe hypermutated. There just isn't enough there for us to be able to make any conclusions. And that's an answer you hate to give. We don't know, but sometimes that's the best way to go because it helps you find the real answer in the future. My guess is, unfortunately, maybe because I'm a pessimist, the DNA has just been sitting there for thousands of years. I don't know that you can recover some of this. I don't think it's a technical question. It's simply the history has destroyed it. It's sat there, and changing environments, being in the elements, that's just what happens. It's the second law of thermodynamics. We live in a fallen world. So I hope eventually we'll have an answer, but I'm not optimistic that we will.
Hey, Dr. Jeanson, Stan put a comment here, just heads up, SELJUK is pronounced SELYUK. Well, I can't pronounce either of them, so but he said, keep up the great and timely work.
I've probably butchered many names since we're talking about languages and peoples all around the globe. So my apologies in advance for past and future mispronunciations of these various people groups.
Now, I know you mentioned there can be some differences genetically and the number of kids that certain groups could have and so on. There's one here from Raw Matt. Dr. Jeanson, I found a study looking at the CO1 gene in mitochondrial DNA that was looking at cancer rates in people groups. They found that African peoples have twice the mutation rate in cancer cells. Does that sort of agree with some of the things you said in regard to there's differences among certain people groups?
Someone sent me that via Facebook over the weekend as well, and I haven't got a chance to look at the raw data, but if it is related to germline, which would be that would be the biggest question. By germline, I mean if we can show that from generation to generation the rate is faster, that would be profound confirmation. But this would be a very intriguing indirect confirmation of that hypothesis, and I'm very anxious to look at it. So yes, very intriguing.
Okay, well, one that we had sent in, have you considered the textual variance that exists between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text regarding the chronology, the chronogenealogy between Shem and Terah? Potentially add 600 years to that time period.
I've considered it from a couple different angles. One from a biblical textual perspective. I'm not a trained theologian. I don't have an MDiv or a THD or any of these sorts of things, but talk to those who have more advanced degrees and try to let the text speak for itself. And I've leaned Masoretic, and I vacillate between a long sojourn in Egypt and a short sojourn in Egypt, and we have these discussions internally. What's intriguing to me is from a genetics perspective, given the data that we have currently, there's a slight superiority of the Masoretic timeline over the Septuagint. So I know people are anxious to add it oftentimes when I talk to those dealing with archaeology. Well, how can we fit all these ancient histories in? My first question is, why don't we reinterpret these through the lens of Scripture and not let the science dictate our reinterpretation of the text? That's just something we all need to keep in mind. We're all sinners and depraved and need to check what we leave as the highest authority. But what I can say as a geneticist is right now, it looks like there's a slight superiority of the Masoretic timeline over the Septuagint, and these things are testable with our genetic data.
So Sean has asked, and this is one of the live questions here, are the Magyars, I don't know how to pronounce that, and Mongols the same group of people?
I've said Magyars, but I might be mispronouncing that as well. Magyars being the people who are the ancestors of the Hungarians. They speak, they have a different language family. So if you think back to the language maps of Europe that we looked at, actually one of these behind me right here, probably can't see it, but there's a spot in Europe that's a different language family. Most European languages are the Indo-European, German, French, English, Spanish, Romanian, and so forth, all of the Indo-European. The Finnic and Hungarian languages are a different language family, and it's the Hungarian peoples that say we came from the Magyars. Magyars are Central Asian in origin, and I've been suggesting, based on the timing and the distribution of the lineages in the group called R1b, this may be the Magyar lineage, and I've said R1a might be the Mongol one. At the end of the day, though, because Central Asia is such a tumultuous place, or maybe I should say, because Central Asia tends to be inhabited by nomadic peoples rather than those who are sedentary, agricultural committed, that sort of thing. My guess is many of these groups were intermixing all the time anyways. So it may be difficult genetically to separate these. I think we see some evidence for two different lineages, but my guess is as you sample more and more of the globe, you're going to see them all become more and more entangled because people intermix, period. But when you're in a place of the part of the world that is nomadic and you're moving around all the time, surely that will lend itself to even more intermixing.
Okay, so one I'm pasting in from the questions that were sent in concerning taking over a country. Do you know which ethnicities would have had the dominant traits so as to mask the traits of previous ones, such as if Africans were in the lineage, why would their traits be masked in a subsequent generation as opposed to the other way around? Is it dependent on who are the majority in the country or dash lineage? There you are. See if you can answer that one.
This relates to a discussion we had in episodes 3, but more so in episode 4, how to silently take over a country. And we walk through the math of slight differences in human reproductive growth. So if you have, and the example we used was, if you have Europeans in 1400, and there were 60 million or so Europeans by one estimate, and you had a group of maybe 60,000 Africans come in, perhaps due to the Islamic slave trade. And the African descent people started intermixing with Europe. If the African peoples had a slightly faster reproductive rate, maybe they produced on average 20% more offspring, not a big difference, very slight. What will happen? What happens is, if it's consistent for several hundred years, today you can get all sorts of people who are of African descent but look Caucasian. And the way the math works out, so first of all, it's going to depend on what traits are we looking at. Is it skin tone? Is it eye shape? And we had some discussion about eye shape in Europeans, especially Eastern Europeans, given what appears to be a strong Central Asian descent in the Y chromosome. And there's all sorts of other things that we use to define ethnicity, height, other physical features. What determines which one plays out? It's hard to predict. It's going to depend, as the question sort of implies, on the math of who's dominant and who's less. So the example I used, you have an overwhelming majority of Caucasian Europeans, 60 million, versus a tiny minority, 60,000 dark-skinned Africans. As those numbers change, and I just invented those numbers. The 60 million is historical, the 60,000 I just used for sake of comparison. We can think of a different scenario with the Mongols coming into Europe. It all really comes down to what is the math of how many people come in. It comes down to how many people died out in the Black Death, if we're talking Europe, which is after the Mongols come in. It's hard to predict unless you get some more firm numbers on how many of each group is there at the start, what happens subsequently, what are the reproductive rates, which specific traits are you looking at. So that's sort of a long-winded non-answer because it relates to so many different parameters.
Well, there's a question here. Forgive me for not pronouncing the name right. Sakar Ray, I'm not sure how to pronounce, but who were the Indo-Europeans, and can you link the groups to the creation of languages at the Tower of Babel, e.g., Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Sino-Tibetan, Proto-Afro-Asiatic, and so on?
This is a fascinating question because even though the series ended, we taped Saturday night's episode a few days prior, and I spent the next Thursday and Friday, looking at some of the other lineages we didn't discuss in as much depth. One of them I started to look at was the subdivisions within Group O. We mentioned it just in passing, episode about 9, I think, looking at the ancient Chinese connection to modern Europe. O is dominant in East Asia. Well, there's 3 major divisions right now, O1, 2, and 3, or I think the modern terms are now O1A, O1B, and O2. I started mapping out the distribution of these subdivisions, and there's what's emerging right now, so far, research at the moment, is they also seem to correlate with the major language families, the Sino-Tibetan for China, some of the, I think it's Thai Kadai in Southeast Asia. You have Austronesian going down from Taiwan into the Philippines and Indonesia all the way over to Madagascar. There's some really intriguing correlations between the genetics and the language that show up there. We saw in episode 19, very intriguing correlations between the African languages and the Y chromosome lineages. And it's really in Europe and India, we didn't talk about India as much, and the Middle East, basically the crossroads of the world that keep intermixing and intermixing, that sort of have blurred and messed up the correlations between language and genetics, because you can change your language, you can't change your DNA. So all that to say, my guess is if you start looking at Africa and East Asia, you might be able to drill deeper into some of these proto-language families and get at the language genetics correlation even deeper than we have so far. For those places like Europe and India, there's been so much intermixing, it's going to be tougher. The other place where it might be really intriguing is in Papua New Guinea and Australia. Isolated regions of the world, they have their own language families, plus they have their isolated genetic lineages, S, K, M, and so forth, as we discussed in episode 16. So the short answer is there are some links that are beginning to emerge, and I'm very intrigued to see where this goes as we get more genetic data in.
Okay, well, one that was sent in about carbon-14. I know you mentioned carbon-14 throughout the series in a couple of places. Since carbon-14 is supposedly good out to 100,000 years, while I believe what we would say is that those using carbon-14 will say it can only be used to 100,000 years, not that we believe 100,000 years. But why would an assigned date of, say, 10,000 or 30,000 not be valid? I think that comes down to understanding the carbon-14 method, right?
Yes, and the basic premises and assumptions in this method is you're looking at the rate of carbon-14 production in the atmosphere. I think I'm not a physicist, but I think it's cosmic rays hit nitrogen, produces carbon-14. There's a decay back to nitrogen, I think, of what it is, and again, my geology friends can correct me if I butchered this. But the assumption in all this is several-fold. You have to assume that the rate of decay is constant, for one. The way you measure this, if I remember correctly, is in terms of carbon-12 to carbon-14. There's a carbon ratio that's relevant to this calculation, and that means it's going to be highly dependent on carbon total in the world, atmosphere, Earth, and so forth. All that to say, what I've heard from my geology colleagues is, after the flood, in which you've just dumped and buried massive amounts of carbon, animals, plants, and so forth, under the Earth's surface, because of the flood, you've just dramatically changed that ratio, and it takes some time for it to come back to equilibrium. And so that's why the earliest ages are so skewed. Now, scientifically, we know that the method as mainstream folks practice it is wrong. You can show this. And this is part of the RATE project, where they dated things like diamonds and coal seams. Coal seams were supposed to be, in mainstream chronology, 300 million years old, and the diamonds billions of years old. Mainstream folks don't think to use carbon-14 because, as they say, well, it's only good to 100,000 years. And it has to do with the detailed chemistry and physics of it, which we won't get into. Well, young Earth scientists said, well, let's test it, because we know from the scripture it's only a few thousand years old, so there still should be some carbon-14 present, and it's present. So the short takeaway from that is there's something wrong with how the mainstream community is practicing this method, because it shouldn't give these results, and it's not due to contamination. They ruled that possibility out. There's something wrong with the method. You have to correct it. The question then becomes, what's the correction factor? And the best candidate right now is the events of the flood, dramatically changing the carbon-14, carbon-12 ratio, the years after the flood requiring some sort of bounce back to reestablish equilibrium. And then at some point thereafter, equilibrium is roughly restored and you can use it reliably again. What I've done in episodes, I think it was 20, 21 and following, was to show that even with genetics, you can try to establish a very preliminary rough correction factor. So just to summarize the points again, the key points here real quickly, because this is such a contentious issue and a key issue. The method as it's currently practiced does not work for ancient timescales. You get carbon-14 and stuff that's supposedly millions of years old shouldn't be there if the mainstream method is valid. So what that means is you have to apply a correction factor. Well, when do you apply the correction factor? You start comparing things of known age to the carbon-14 results, and when they start matching up, now it's good. And of course, when you go back to the ancient history, there's mismatches. So what I've tried to develop in this series is a way to, at those mismatched areas, bring things in line and apply a correction factor. So why is the assigned date not valid? The short answer is the method as practiced doesn't work, so you have to apply a correction factor, and that's in the arena of applying the correction factor.
There's a comment here from Nicholas Whitmire, and I thought I'd just mention this. It's not a question so much, but because of what's going on in our culture, he says, one family, one humanity. The nation could really know this right now and forget the mainstream media and propaganda that pulls their strings. And, I agree with that. What you're showing is the human race is much more closely related than most people realize. And of course, from a biblical perspective, the answer to all racism that we're seeing permeating people's thinking right now, it's very simple. You get back to God's word and understand we're all one family, one race, all descendants of Adam. We're all equal before God, all sinners, all need the same solution, Jesus Christ. And really, there's no such thing as racial reconciliation because we're all one race. As my good friend Dr. Charles Ware puts it, we want grace relations because God showed his grace to us and we need to show that same grace to others, not race relations. So this actually fits with that message that we give, the one blood, one race message. Just above Nicholas is a question. I do not know how to pronounce that name, Yasiel or whatever it is. Why is Pacific Island DNA closer to Native American rather than the supposed Asian?
This is a good question that we didn't touch on in any sort of depth. I think what this question is referring to is not the Y chromosome. There's been some mainstream publications, so I'm answering the question that I think is being asked, so it might be misunderstanding, but here we go. There have been some publications looking at the DNA inherited from both parents, not the Y chromosome, not the mitochondrial DNA, not the one from only dad, only mom, but from both parents. There's, at a very low percentage, some hints of Pacific Islander, ancient Pacific influence in Native American DNA today. Why is that there? Is it stuff that's persisted from the earliest Americans? So let me try to now synthesize that finding with what we've been discussing episodes 11 to 16, where I argued that today's Native Americans were not the first. They came over in the 80 era, wiped out whoever was here first. Episode 16, we speculated that whoever was here first may have been Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, Australian Aborigine. There's sort of a latitudinal band of dark-skinned peoples. You look at some of the Olmec carvings, could they have had some of these dark-skinned physical features? Maybe. That's a really intriguing hypothesis. So I'm wondering if this DNA signature, which is inherited from both parents, is valid. And I question that because it's a largely statistical argument. You're dealing with really low frequency stuff here, so you have to take it with a grain of salt and say, okay, is this a real signal? Is this just kind of an artifact? Well, if it's real, if it is a real Pacific Islander signature, is this an ancient echo of the first peoples? And I'm suspicious that it might be. So it's a very interesting question to explore further.
Interesting. We had a question here from answers.tv asking about Y chromosome and 10 lost tribes of Israel. What would you say in regard to that question?
If I'm understanding this correctly, it's sort of a question of the Samaritans. The northern tribes get conquered, judged by God. Judah hangs on for a while longer. And it's really a question of the larger Jewish diaspora. Can we identify the lineage of Abraham? Because they call Abraham their father? And the short answer is we don't have enough data yet to know for sure. But the exciting thing is we should know as we get more and more Y chromosome sequences from peoples around the globe. So it's a question I hope we'll have an answer to in the near future.
Sounds like we need to start our own company to do more Y chromosome research and mapping around the globe. Okay, so another question that was sent into us, in fact, we have many, many questions that were sent into us. And this particular one, as we'll be able to see there, buccal swabs from living Maya populations, don't they support Asian descent? If they are indeed African, what would we look for?
So this is coming from what we discussed in episode 14, what happened to the Maya. And I was arguing, based on the Y chromosome tree, that the Mayans may have been some of the earliest peoples, and today's Native Americans are from this second group, or maybe even a third group that came over. The DNA that we see today traces its ancestry to Central Asia in the fairly recent past, after the time of Christ. And if you look at the archaeological dates for the Mayans, they seem to predate that, as if they were from a different genetic lineage. So the question then is, shouldn't then today's Mayans have a different genetic lineage? Shouldn't that be the place to go to find this ancient Native American DNA? The Mayans that have been tested show up as this more recent DNA lineage. In episode 14, we talked about the shape of Native American population growth, decline, and then growth again, where they came over in the 600s, maybe AD, underwent rapid population growth and dispersal. You see the flatlining dealing with the massive loss of population due to the European incursion, and then the regrowth 1900s. Well, if Noah is where I think he is, where they undergo massive population growth, is right when the central Mayan lowland civilization collapses. There are some who hang on in the Yucatan. There is talk, and I think it's even in the Native American accounts themselves, that a group from central Mexico came over and overtook them. I'm wondering if that's true, and that today's Mayans, like so many other peoples around the globe, are the products of intermixing with these more recent invaders. Now, we don't have a ton of Mayan sequences, and if I wanted to go looking for an ancient lineage that's maybe dark-skinned, that represents the first Native Americans, that's one of the top places to go. You want to find the Native American lineage, go start sequencing the DNA of people in Guatemala, perhaps some of the more indigenous people in Peru, because there you have an ancient archaeological record as well. So the short answer is, do they support Asian descent? Yes, the ones we've sequenced so far, but there aren't that many of them that we've sequenced. And if they're dark-skinned, they may not be going back to the African lineages. They may connect perhaps to the Southeast Asian ones, or the Pacific ones, the New Guinea ones, the Australian Aborigine ones, these sorts of things, and that'll show up on where they branch off on the tree.
Well, Dr. Jeanson, there's a comment here from Jesse Brown, which has reminded me to do something, and that is to tell people that this is episode 24, and you can watch all the episodes on our YouTube channel free, but it's higher quality on our streaming service. And I encourage people to get our streaming service, answers.tv. And for a year, it works out at just over $3 per month, and there's over 2,000 items on there right now. But Jesse Brown said this, with everybody talking about racism, I'm name dropping Dr. Jeanson on different forums and news, DNA and One People Under God. You're being name dropped on lots of forums. But that's good, because we want people to go and watch this particular series, and we want them to know about the answers that we have at Answers in Genesis. And we do have some great answers. We've got some great books that deal with all these topics. So another question that was sent in was this one, and I've got number 13 there because actually I forgot to edit that out, but that's okay. That's 13 of the many questions that were sent in to us, and we'll get to the rest of them next week, as well as other live questions. People want to send in more questions as well. But this particular one, did you imply that the line of Japheth was cut off? Genesis 10:2 mentions the sons of Japheth as Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, goes right through there. Gomer's son included, I have no idea how to pronounce all these names. I just guess them when I'm reading the Bible. And then you got Ezekiel predicted a future war against Israel. I don't know anyone on the planet who can answer all these sorts of questions. I don't think anyone else has done this research on the Y chromosome. Research has been done around the world in collating all this together. But anyway, Dr. Jeanson.
This is another form of the question we were dealing with earlier. If Noah is where I think he is, why are there only these two branches coming off from him, not the third? Is Japheth gone? And there's a couple different answers. One is Noah may not be where I think he is. And there's two other positions where you do have three branches. So it may be a case of, I guessed wrong. that may be the simplest and most likely answer. We're at an early stage, and I had my best guess. I had my favorite answer, and it was wrong. That may be one answer. So everyone should keep that in mind, because we're at an early stage. And there's several different candidate positions for Noah. I picked him there because it seems to fit the math that we have best at the moment. You can see episodes 20 and following for some of the discussions along those lines. It may be that Japheth was a twin, and so actually all three of them are here, and I just haven't recognized it yet. It may be that Japheth's line is still out there, and because we've only got 5,000 or less high-quality Y chromosome sequences, we just haven't detected it yet. Remember, Japheth's his lineage had half as many names in Genesis 10 as Shem and Ham, and so he was, to me, at a mathematical disadvantage from the earliest stages. And you've seen in the episode 7 and following just how much conquest, migration, overtaking, population replacement has happened all over the place around the globe. And so if you're behind the eight ball, so to speak, at the very beginning of the population multiplication process to go from 70 names at Babel to nearly 4 billion men alive today, nearly 8 billion people total, that may be a consequence that we see today. So these are important points, and several folks mentioned, well, what about the eschatological thing? We don't have a strong eschatological ministry stance here because we're interdenominational, but these are important things to keep in mind, whatever your eschatological position is. And I'm optimistic and content not having an answer at this point because I know the answer will emerge. As we get more and more DNA sequences, it'll very quickly become clear, well, quickly depending on how many DNA sequences we do obtain, how fast we obtain them. It'll very quickly become clear where exactly Noah is, which will then tell us if this is even a question. So if it becomes quickly clear, nope, this position right here for Noah that you've been saying, that's wrong, well, it's one of those other positions where there's three branches, problem solved. If Noah is where I think he is, with time, my prediction is more lineages will emerge, and then be like, oh, well, there's Japheth. We just didn't see him much. So my point is, at this stage, I don't think we see a contradiction to any of these texts because it's too early to say where Japheth's lineage is. We don't yet know exactly where Noah is, which is the most important question. And even once we establish that, there's so many more DNA sequences to obtain in the future that the answer still is outstanding.
Well, Dr. Jeanson, from the live questions here, there's one from Fidel, and I just thought this is an interesting one. It's sort of it's almost off topic, but not really. Question: Genesis 5:32 says, "And being Noah 500 years old, he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth." Could it be that they were triplets? I've actually had people ask me that over the years.
Yes, and I had a long discussion with one of my collaborators and others about this, I think several months ago. And we tried to go through the text and how the text treats twins and such. There's a statement, I think, in Genesis 10 talking about Japheth the elder or Shem the elder or the younger. If you look at various Bible translations, English Bible translations, I think they disagree on who's the older, who's the younger. So when Bible translations disagree, that tells me the Hebrew is difficult to translate. And we looked at Abraham, how he's described. When exactly was he born? Is he first in the birth order? Are there clues by who's listed first in Genesis 5? Because I think Shem is listed first. Is that a position of prominence? Does it deal with birth order? All I can say at this point is I think it's a real possibility that they may have been triplets. I don't know that it's a strong possibility, given what we see in genetics and such. But the possibility, at least of twins, is something I think we should keep in mind going forward. It's something I definitely personally forget frequently when dealing with this. But given this being the start, the restart of the human race after the flood. And this being so explicit in the text of Scripture, it's something we need to always keep in the back of our minds going forward as we continue to think about where exactly is Noah in this tree and what were the immediate events following Babel and up to the point of the famine of Joseph's day.
So we had a history teacher, someone who's a history teacher, tell us how wonderful this series is, and they love it. There's a question here from Christian. This is another live one. And then I thought we'd go to sort of start to bring this to a conclusion tonight, and we'll continue on with part 2. We'll agree to do that next week at 8 p.m. on the Saturday night, seeing as Sunday in America is Father's Day. So we'll let you have Father's Day off. How's that? And I can have Father's Day off too. But Christian asked this question: is it safe to say that all of humanity would include the DNA of all 3 of Noah's sons and their wives at some level due to Babel, early post-Babel intermarriages, etc.?
Maybe you can reread that, because I heard 2 possibilities for the question. I want to make sure I've got the right question in mind when I answer it.
Okay, and we'll see if we can put it up here. It's from Christian. Is it safe to say that all of humanity would include the DNA of all 3 of Noah's sons and their wives at some level due to pre-Babel, early post-Babel intermarriages, etc.?
Okay, I think I understand the question better. And I think the answer depends on what compartment of DNA you're talking about. If you're talking about DNA that's inherited only from mom or only from dad, so if you're talking mitochondrial DNA only from mom, Y chromosome DNA only from dad, you're going to get a different answer than if it's DNA from both parents. So the DNA from both parents is 99% of all our DNA. And is there going to be echo of all 3 of those couples? I'm going to say almost certainly. Were those people intermixing after the flood but before Babel? I'm going to guess almost certainly. So at some level, I'd say we probably do have an echo of that, because our DNA that's inherited from both parents gets diluted by half every generation. So I'm 50% mom, 50% dad, and then my children are 25% of their grandparents, and their children are going to be 12.5%, and boom, 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 it goes down really fast, exponentially. The amount of signal becomes a very small fraction. So teasing out what part of me came from Shem, and which part from Japheth, and which part from this wife or that wife, that's going to be difficult mathematically because of the biology. When it comes to this inherited from one or the other, you're only going to see in your cells the signal from one of these 6 people. So mitochondrial DNA is only going to be from one of the 3 ladies, the Y chromosome from only one of the 3 men, because that's just the way the biology works out. But you could have had ancestors from any of them in your family tree. It's just because of the biology of how mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome is inherited, it's just tough to tease it all out. So the short answer to that question is, given what we've seen all throughout history and biblically about conquest and intermixing, almost certainly we're a mix of all of them. Being able to prove that genetically becomes a really complex math and biological problem.
Okay, the second last one for tonight. If your questions that you sent in weren't answered, we'll be collating them all for next week, and then we'll do part 2 and see if we can get through as many as we can. But this one here, are you going to be inviting males to contribute DNA to AIG for Y chromosome mapping to achieve more complete history of the human race?
This is a fun question because I can answer it a number of different ways. And there's a number of different things that we've been doing internally that I can talk about to some extent, and some to not some extent. If you saw episode 22 and 23, you know that one of the major conclusions was this is just the beginning of understanding the ethnic and genetic history of humanity. We've come a long way. We've found some tremendous discoveries and tremendous signatures of political history in the DNA of humanity, but we've only got 5,000 or so men into this question. So there's a long way to go and a lot more answers to discover, and the whole world is open for investigation. There's more African history to discover, and Middle Eastern and European and Central Asian and East Asian and Pacific and Americas and all that. And from watching these episodes, if you've seen the whole series, there's a whole bunch of questions we haven't answered because we don't have the data yet. Who were the first Americans? Is there a Jewish lineage? What about the earliest episode? And so many more questions we could go. What happened to the ancient Romans, the ancient Egyptians? All these sorts of questions. And I want to know the answers for a number of reasons. There's apologetic value to say, look, here in our DNA, you can see the echoes of history, and you can only see it if you have the 4,500-year time scale that the Bible teaches. That's a huge, profound confirmation of what the Bible says. It has immediate popular appeal. Looking at the biology of June bugs might get some people interested. Looking at the biology of you and me tends to get everyone interested. So it has a wide reach potentially as well. And I just want to know. I want to know what happened. There's so many shocks that have emerged from what we've done so far. Could my lineage be ancient Egyptian ultimately? I kind of want to know this answer, and I'm sure many other people do. So lots of justification for exploring this further. What have we done internally? We've done a couple of different things. Number one, we talked several months ago, we began discussions of what are we going to do when people say, what can you tell me about my history? So we've already had those discussions internally about should we start Ancestry in Genesis or something along those lines, where we either sequence their DNA or they give us their DNA and say, can you tell me what this means? These are all discussions we're having internally. There's business side to this, the cost benefit, what does it cost to do it? I can say right now, we're probably not going to start an Ancestry, a DNA sequencing company, just because the overhead for this is enormous, probably millions of dollars. You can go to a mainstream company and have them get your DNA sequence, and then you can send us the electronic sequence. But even analyzing the raw DNA sequence and saying, here's what it means, has a cost associated with it. So these are things we're investigating. At a minimum, hopefully by having a book out next year sometime, dealing with what we've discussed, if you've done some sort of test, okay, I know I belong to this Y chromosome group, you can then look up and say, aha, well, this means I must have some of this in my family tree. Or you have extended family members. So what I might do, I've done my Y chromosome sequence through a mainstream company. Ladies do not have a Y chromosome, so how am I going to know my wife's side? Well, if I get her dad or her brother, that might say the contribution from that side. And you can begin to think through your own family tree, the further and further branches, to say what is the mosaic of lineages that contributes to me and my lineage. These are the sorts of things you can do already, given what we've discussed.
So, now, Dr. Jeanson, is this sort of leading up to the last question I had there, which was, because you sort of overlapped with this, I think, and that is, how can one have a Y chromosome analysis done? Is this cost prohibitive? Could you advise me on any Y chromosome ancestry companies? Because obviously what you're saying is, the DNA sequence people send in today, what they're telling them is not really that accurate, correct?
I'll answer this question, then I want to wrap back around to the larger research question of the world and what can people do personally for what AIG is doing research-wise. So you're watching, you say, I want to have insights into who I am. What can I do to get Y chromosome analysis? Most of the popular genetic testing companies, Family Tree DNA, Ancestry.com, you can just go on and on. There's all sorts of ones out there, and they change. Some start up and then fail, and some continue on. You can find one out there and see if they offer a Y chromosome sequencing as part of their package. Some are standalone, some are part of it. There's just a whole diversity out there. I won't take the time to walk through all the details because you can find it online. And for various prices. And prices change. And prices change depending on how much you do volume-wise as well, as I've discovered myself, which we'll get to the second part of the question here in a moment. So if you want to know your lineage, my recommendation is you submit a DNA sample to one of these companies. And you have to evaluate for yourself their privacy assurances or not. These are all, I've had some of these questions come up to me personally on Facebook. What do you recommend in terms of, is it safe? Is the government going to get it? These sorts of things. And every person has to weigh the benefits and risks. And I'm not going to say one way or the other what you should do, because you have to decide for yourself how that works out for your family. So you get your sequence, and they'll tell you all sorts of things. If they do the Y chromosome, they'll say, this is the group to which you belong. They'll probably give you the evolutionary interpretation. Well, you go back to such and such group 30,000 years ago and probably located to this part of the world and so on and so forth. You can probably discard most of the analysis part. The group is what's relevant. So you pay the money, you know what group you're in. Now you can go back to the video series, hopefully eventually to a book, and say, aha, this means what my lineage is. At some point, depending again on our own internal cost benefit analysis, we might be able to give more detail. So this story is going to continue to grow. This is how much of the human story we can tell with the 5,000 global human sequences we have now. And as more DNA sequences come in, we're going to be able to tell more of the story. So you submit us a DNA sequence. Let's say we started Ancestry and Genesis. You went to a commercial company, you got your Y chromosome group, or you got your Y chromosome sequence. They tell you, let's say it's R1b, because that's, let's say you're Caucasian of Western European descent, high probability you're in that group. You can go to episode 10 where we talked about R1b. Okay, sounds like I might be part of Central Asian Magyar descent. That's an initial answer. In a year or two, we might have more detail on R1b. And if you get a full DNA sequence of your Y chromosome, you might be able to send it to us. Again, this is not a promise. It's just theoretical possibility, depending on how things work out. And we can perhaps at that point have more details on the specific historical events that led up to R1b in Europe, and more specific details on who these people were and who they're connected to. That's the sort of information that will grow with time. And hopefully what I want to know with time is, who did R1b originally come from? Magyars come into Europe 1000 AD or so, 900 AD. What were they doing for the prior 3,000 years after Babel? Who did they come from? Do they have connections to Assyria? These sorts of things. At some point, my hope is we'll be able to answer the question, I'm of Western European descent, which is actually Central Asian, which is actually, and you can connect it all the way back to the beginning. Something we can't do yet, but something we can do in the future. Now, for me personally, the research priorities, people say, I want to contribute to what AIG is doing. Can you get my DNA sequence? Will that be of help? The way we're prioritizing things now depends on what the mainstream community is doing. Why spend precious donor money on something that's just going to duplicate what the mainstream community is doing? And there's lots of projects out there, samples of the globe, that with time will be published, made publicly accessible, and then I can download them at no cost to anyone, just my time here in the office. The projects I'm prioritizing for us personally, we really need some more of this group's DNA sequence, is a complex mix of political factors. I'm a Caucasian US citizen, and that can open doors and shut them in different parts of the globe. I'm not going to give you all the details because some of what I'm doing is politically sensitive and has been going on behind the scenes for several months. And at some point, if we need to raise money for it, we'll tell you about it. But you can use your imagination and probably begin to answer some of the groups we're looking at. Some of it deals with logistical issues. For example, do you want to go to a political war-torn part of the globe and ask for DNA sequences? Probably low chance of having success. So these are all the sorts of things we're thinking through. We've got projects in the works right now that I'm not going to tell you about yet because of the sensitivity of them. But at some point, we may have a need for people submitting their own DNA sequences. We may have needs for people saying, are you connected to such and such a group? Can you open the door for us? Is there a way for us to have access? This is all stuff that's been going on and will continue to go on behind the scenes. So stay tuned for what will hopefully be, this project will last a lifetime. This is the history of the world rediscovered, and we're just at the beginning stages.
Well, thanks, Dr. Jeanson. Somebody here asked, will you be able to reply to comments offline if you're unable to get to all the questions during your live presentations? All I can say is submit them. You can submit them through the answersandgenesis.org website, and you'll certainly have a look at them, and we'll do our best. But we get a lot of questions, and we try to answer those that we can. But we've got a lot more questions we didn't get to today from those who put them in live, and also the ones that were already sent in. If you want to send in some more, and we will do next week as well, 8 p.m. And that'll be the final one. We'll have to make that the final one. That'll be episode 25. And then you need to get researching on that book and get that book out next year. Encourage people, you can watch the whole series on the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel. And it's higher quality, actually, if you watch it on answers.tv. And good news, by July 4th for answers.tv, which is web-based right now, by July 4th, we're actually going to have all the apps for Roku, Google, Android, Apple TV, all of those. So we've got answers.tv underway, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of videos on there. And of course, more of Dr. Jeanson on there as well. And I encourage people, come to the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum. They've reopened after they were shut down by the COVID-19 situation. And, we have exhibits at both, dealing with the Tower of Babel and looking at population people groups around the world, and dealing with the racism and prejudice issue as well. So with that, Dr. Jeanson, it's been an incredible series, and people are so excited to look for this book that's coming out, and they can go back and watch the rest of this series now on answers.tv and YouTube. And next Saturday night, which will be the June the 20th, is that correct? June the 20th?
June 20th, yes.
June 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will do part 2 of question and answers. And with that, we'll say good night to everybody from Northern Kentucky. We're here in the Creation Museum Answers and Genesis offices at Northern Kentucky, and good night from Dr. Jeanson and myself.